As we begin, I invite you to join me in the spirit of prayer with these words from Psalm 19. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, God, our rock and redeemer. In today's passage, we meet Peter, a local fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. Many of Jesus' earliest followers were fishermen, and so at the beginning of my preparation for this sermon, I asked some of our most avid fisher people here at CUCC why Jesus might have targeted fishermen to be among his first disciples. Pete mused that patience might be a key trait of fisher people. Perhaps Jesus recognized that patience is an essential quality in the work of building beloved community. A.K., who has written entire books on fly fishing, noted that fishing and ministry both require a level of comfort with trusting things that you cannot see. Mark offered a lot. The first, which doesn't preach well, was fishing requires a lot of deception. So we threw that out. Most relevant for our community today is that in fish community, the diversity of a fish community is a measure of that community's resiliency and therefore its strength. And I really like that. In Peter's time, fishing on the Sea of Galilee was part of an increasingly state-controlled industry within the Roman Empire. Herod Antipas, the local leader, the son of that Herod who hunted the baby Jesus, was commercializing Galilee's fishing industry, pushing locals out in favor of scale and economy and export of more fish to Rome. His goal was something that might sound familiar to those of you who are reading our headlines. He wanted Peter's livelihood to become a state-regulated, elite-profiting enterprise. Local fishermen like Peter, who had been living subsistently for decades, not even decades, generations, were being burdened with taxes of 25 to 40% of their catch just for the right to continue to fish. It was a day-to-day living if you were lucky. Most rented their boats and paid a day use fee just to put them in the water. So empty nets equaled debt to empire. And then Jesus shows up and fills Peter's empty nets to the breaking point and calls him away from this struggling livelihood. Peter was not just offering him a vocational or spiritual calling, he was offering him an alternative to exploitation, along with the abundance that he needed to be able to financially step away from it. But when Jesus tells Peter, from now on you will be catching people, I'll be honest, it makes me cringe a little bit. The phrase catching people, for me, evokes images of forced conversion, of coercive evangelism, even the unjust systems that are catching people in this country today. People right here in this community, and yes, more in our wider community, live with daily fear of being caught in systems that trap them in things like hunger and poverty and exclusion. Some of us are food insecure, struggling to afford groceries. Some of us are housing insecure, unsure where we will sleep tonight or how we will afford our rising rent. Some of us live in fear of being caught in the icy waters of detention and deportation, and some of us carry the weight of a world where our rights are actively under threat because of our identity and because of who we love. And yet, even in these deeply chaotic 2025 waters, it is my joy to profess a message of resistance. This message is of a promise that is so big and so unreasonable that only God can keep it, that we are held in the love of God. In our other sacred reading today, we heard Julian of Norwich share a little of her vision of this tiny thing, no bigger than a hazelnut, held in her hand. It was a vision of everything that God has ever created. And in it, Julian saw three things: that God made it, that God loves it, and that God preserves it. No matter what catches us up in this life, fallen forces cannot ultimately come between our God and God's love for us. We are held. So when I read this passage, I hear Jesus calling Peter to partner with him in the divine work of casting God's wide net of love. Now, it's also worth noting that you're getting this sermon from somebody with a little childhood fishing trauma. When I was in 3rd grade, our class got invited to come down to the port of Wilmington, Delaware, and go out on a fishing boat. It was meant to be an exciting science field trip, but for me, it was a front row seat to fish murder. You see, I was blessed with a godmother who is a very persuasive and loud member of the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and she had already convinced me to be a vegetarian. So when the nets of fish got pulled up, I was not happy. But then things took an even darker and less just turn. The fishermen sorted out all of the commercially valuable fish and put them into a refrigerated hold for sale later. And then they just left the rest of the marine life that they had caught gasping on the deck of the boat. Rays and crabs and small sharks and small fish of all kinds just flapping around and gasping for life, and no one was doing anything about it. So I waited until my teacher was a little distracted, and I darted across the safety line that our captain had established when we came on board, and it was my dearest hope that day to kick just one of those creatures over the end of the boat and back into bay water where they would live again. Maybe also I was hoping there would be like a 3rd grade revolution where everybody would rush up and do this. And this did not end particularly well for me. I am not the hero of this story, but my tiny attempt at resistance did compel a fisherman on that boat to roll his eyes at me and have mercy on me. He grabbed a hose and he washed all of the struggling creatures back into the bay, and he got a lot of trouble with his captain. But the memory helps me remember that we don't come into this world naturally conformed to or desensitized by all of its messed up systems. I know that as a grown-up, I am often paralyzed, trying to figure out how to change something like the whole extractive fishing industry while a fish is literally dying at my feet, within reach. And sometimes going back to that innocent instinct to help the one gasping being that is within our reach is good. And then to ask that one struggling being, how can I help? Who else in your network can I help? So again, when I hear Jesus calling Peter to catch people, I hear Jesus calling Peter to partner with him in the divine work of resisting systems that seek to capture and control and throw away all the things that it does not deem valuable. Now, you might be thinking, Nicole, you're preaching to the choir here. But I feel it's essential to preach this message specifically in this place, to rename and reclaim this passage from the harmful interpretations of our past. The history of this place, this beautiful Boulder Valley that most of us get to call home, is a story of the prolonged justification of terrible things in the name of our Jesus. And we need to remember and be ready to resist when histories of unjust capture and control are actively repeating themselves. I want to ask us to get even less comfy than owning that we're Boulderites. Our own denomination, the UCC, has a terrible history with Native American boarding schools. These schools aimed to Christianize and civilize the first peoples of what is now our country. The bone-chilling philosophy of these schools was, kill the Indian, save the soul. So when our lectionary serves up scripture that can and has led to things like that, we have to take great pause and we have to take great caution. We have to pause to reflect on this passage so that we can name and disrupt when our history, our religious tradition, and our present catch people in the wrong ways. We have to pause to reimagine the meaning of this passage in ways that resist harm and embrace justice, and then to proclaim that not just through our words, but with our lives, especially when the gospel is being wielded loudly in the name of hate. We are called to love louder. We must have Jesus' words on our tongues now too, and in our hands now too. After reflecting on the ways that the hands gathered here today, and the hands that are not gathered here today because they've been retreating for the last 2 days, how you all do the work of God, here is what I heard as those alternative interpretations of Jesus' call to catch people. What if catching people means weaving nets of belonging, sustaining this and other communities where all are gathered in and valued and loved? What if it means casting safety nets, ensuring that no one goes under in our current systems of injustice and poverty and exclusion? What if it means turning to our partners, as Peter did when his nets miraculously got so full, joining in the work of others so that we can do more justice, more reconciliation, more care for God's beloved creation than we could do if we tried to lift those nets alone? I also think it's kind of beautiful that Peter's story is just beginning in today's passage, and he does answer the call and leave it all to follow Jesus. And following that call disrupts and costs and reshapes him. And not even Peter, the rock of our church, does that perfectly. After his 3 infamous denials of Jesus, after Jesus' death, after all of that, do you know what Peter does? He goes fishing. He goes back to fishing, maybe believing that his calling is over, maybe believing that he fell short and that he failed his friend. And just like before, he spends a long night and he catches nothing. The Gospel of John tells us that at dawn, a stranger on the shore asks him to cast his nets one more time. And his nets overflow again. And just like that, Peter recognizes the risen Christ. And after making him a breakfast of said fish, Jesus does not rebuke him for his failures. He simply asks him 3 times this question: Peter, do you love me? And each time, when Peter says yes, Christ gives him the call to the same old, beautiful work, in different words: feed my sheep. God's call is not a one-time event. As we like to say in the UCC, God is still speaking. And I don't know about you, but I find a lot of hope in that. When we respond, God is still holding us. When we listen, we find God is still speaking. And when we act, we get to become part of the embodied, continuing work of God in this world today. We become partners in the work of furthering God's vision for a world where everybody has enough and nobody needs to be afraid. So friends, I invite you to gather courage and to listen, because God is still calling, and the nets of God's love need casting more than ever. So now I invite you to turn to your neighbors in groups of 2 or 3 and reflect on any of these questions. Where have you experienced being gathered up in or doing the work of casting a net of belonging, safety, or justice in your own life? Where do you feel most called right now to cast a wider net of love, justice, and care? And how do you see the ways that we are casting our nets as a community, as participation in the ongoing movement of God's love, justice, and renewal in the world? And we'll come back in just a few minutes when Philip rings the bell.